Okay. Good morning, everyone. Is that too much? Do I need to move that? Okay. Go just a tad. If you'd like to turn there, we're going to finish up Job chapter 39 this morning and move into chapter 40. Give you just a moment to turn there. And we'll ask David to a word of prayer before we begin our class this morning.
Our Father, we're thankful for the opportunity we now have to study more from your word. We pray that you help each of us have our own life. We might better understand your word. We pray that we encourage this morning as we direct our class, we can understand your word. We pray, Father, for the ones that didn't make it out this morning, and we pray that you will help them get better soon, and this is well they can come back with us. We pray now that you will be with us in our study together. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, David. We had gotten through verse 25 last week, so we're going to pick up in verse 26. Just a really quick recap, nothing like last week's recap, but our quick recap was that God finally granted Job what Job thought he wanted, which was an audience and an opportunity to make his case. That began in chapter 38. And God, rather than giving Job the exact encounter that Job thought he wanted, God comes to him and says, okay, I've got some questions for you first. And as we went through chapter 38 and here in chapter 39, God's questions have revolved around comparing Job's wisdom, testing Job's wisdom against the wisdom and knowledge of God. And we're going to finish up that particular line of questioning here with the end of this chapter. So we'll go back and reread verses 26 through 30. If you remember last week when we left off, he was going through various animals of creation, things that were not domesticated animals, they were wild animals. So things Job wouldn't necessarily have known a whole lot about. He might have thought he did, but when questioned by God, realizes he really doesn't. Before that, God had questioned him about things around creation in terms of the earth and the weather and the sky and the heavens. And then he turned to the other creations that God had made and said, what do you even know about them? So we're going to pick up here with the hawk and the eagle. Again, this is God speaking. Is it by your understanding that the hawk soars and spreads his wings toward the south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? On the rock he dwells and makes his home, on the craggy rock and stronghold. From there he spies out the prey, his eyes behold it from afar. His young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there he is. So the last of the animal examples that God mentions are birds of prey. Here he describes the hawk and the eagle. Obviously there are many others. We've all seen vultures. If you see something laying on the road, I'm sure you've seen some vultures and crows and things. Earlier, God had used the ostrich, a flightless bird, and here he uses two birds that do fly, and the reason that they can fly is so that they can hunt. So we'd asked a while back, wasn't it interesting that God would create the ostrich, an animal with wings that can't fly? What would be the purpose? Point is that the ostrich didn't need to fly. It was really fast. It could find what it needed to on the ground. It foraged, ate vegetation, but it could also outrun its enemy. So The ostrich didn't truly need to fly to be successful. The hawk and the eagle, the example we're giving here, are dependent on being able to fly in order to find their food. So there's a purpose to it. We appreciate today, thanks to scientific study, that different birds are designed differently. Birds in particular that fly have lighter bone structures and wings that leverage aerodynamics. As man, we've just begun to understand aerodynamics, I guess with the Wright brothers. But God understood it from the beginning, and what he created the birds leveraged that information. What do you think? Did man really figure out how to leverage the concept of a wing? No, all he did was copy what he saw around him in nature, realize this is why the bird is successful at flying. This was God's creation and design, and man just did his best to adapt it. If a man did have wings, he'd still never succeed in flying. That required a different design. We're much too dense, we're much too heavy. Our wings would have to be enormous in order to carry us. But only God had the knowledge and wisdom to make these different designs possible in different creatures. And that's what I had through verse 30. I'm going to do a couple of general comments I had about the entire chapter, and then we'll see if you have any comments or questions yourselves. So I captured what was in David Guzik commentary. He says, though Job didn't know these principles of the natural order, at the same time he had to admit that the natural order all seemed to work pretty well. All these questions brought Job before another truth. I see that this world, made by God, operates with remarkable order and wisdom. Can I deny his wisdom and government of all things just because there are things in my own life I don't understand? Or should I simply trust this God who does all these other things so marvelously well? We might be tempted to wish that God had explained to Job here exactly what was going on. We have the benefits of chapters 1 and 2. We understand that this whole thing is nothing what any of his friends have suggested. It's not what Elihu has suggested. It is Satan testing him, trying to convince him to leave God. And we might be tempted to say, boy, I wish God had just come out and told Job this. But he chooses not to. These events are not punishment from God. They weren't random applications of blessings or cursings, as has been suggested, in the speeches earlier. They were the result of Job being tested by Satan. But that does not occur in these closing chapters. God doesn't reveal that to him. It's obviously revealed at some point, though that's not recorded for us. Or I presume we would never have chapters 1 and 2. Someone, somewhere, had to have been revealed to. What we do get, though, is God coming to Job, not as a judge, not as a prosecutor. He could have easily attacked Job for the things that he had said that were improper. Now, don't get me wrong. Not everything that Job said was improper by any means. But there were points in his despair when he said things that really challenged God. But God doesn't come to him in anger or like a prosecutor or a judge. Instead, he comes to him as a teacher. Job had said earlier that he could no longer feel God's presence with him. The reality is that God had never left Job. But now, in this conversation, Job truly senses God's closeness and relationship he has with him again. And I think that was the thing out of everything that Job had lost. That was the thing that was the most difficult for him was to lose that sense of a close relationship with God. And here it's restored. A gentleman by the name of Elmer B. Smick wrote, "What these speeches do not contain is almost as important as what they do. The speeches do not reverse the Lord's judgment in the prologue about Job. Remember, God said that Job was a righteous man who loved him. Satan was wrong in impugning Job's inner reason for being righteous, and the friends were wrong about Job's outward conduct as a reason for his suffering. Job did not get the bill of indictment or verdict of innocence that he had really wanted, but neither was he humiliated with a list of sins he had committed for which he was being punished. Job says that he's a righteous man, that he is a good man. Does that make Job a perfect man? Of course not. No one's perfect. So, was there sin in Job's life? Yes. Could God have indicted him for that sin? Certainly. But that's not what happened here. God didn't come down and say, well, you say you're a righteous man. Let me reveal to you every sin you've ever committed. Could have easily done that to you. And a gentleman by the name of George Bradley wrote, one thought and only one is brought into the foreground here. The world is full of mysteries, strange, unapproachable, overpowering mysteries that man cannot read. Trust in the power and in the wisdom and in the goodness of him, the Almighty One, who rules it. So a good takeaway from what we learn in this chapter. So before we move on to chapter 40, does anybody have any questions or comments you'd like to bring up? I'll try to look all the way around and catch even Marge. No, okay, we're quiet this morning. Everybody not have their extra coffee, right? All right, we're going to go through and read all of chapter 40 together and then go back and study it. And the Lord said to Job, shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? He who argues with God, let him answer it. Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? Have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? Adorn yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowings of your anger and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them all in the dust together, bind their faces in the world below. Then I will acknowledge to you that your own right hand can save you. Behold, Behemoth, which I made as I made you, he eats grass like an ox. Behold, his strength is in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs are bars of iron. He is the first of the works of God. Let him who made him bring near his sword. For the mountains yield food for him, where all the wild beasts play. Under the lotus plants he lives, in the shelter of the reeds and in the marsh. For his shade, the lotus trees cover him. The willows of the brook surround him. Behold, if the river is turbulent, he is not frightened. He is confident, though Jordan rushes against his mouth. Can one take him by his eyes, or pierce his nose with a snare? So if we go back and look at verses 1 and 2, God questions to Job with the intent of teaching him just how great a difference there is between the wisdom of man and the wisdom of God. And that concluded in chapter 39. Job has at times seemed to find fault with how God was treating him and sought to contend with God. He desired to present his case before God, believing that he could argue and succeed in that argument. And that was regarding the treatment that he considered to be unfair toward him. He felt he was righteous and yet was being punished. If we refer back to Job chapter 23, verses 3 through 7, here's what Job said at that time. "Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would know what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No, he would pay attention to me. An upright man could argue with him, and I would be acquitted forever by my judge." That's one of those statements along the way where I feel like Job probably wrongly challenged God. And he regrets it now, being faced with God. But he was convinced at that time, and again, in his despair, that if I could just plead my case before God, I can convince him that what's happened to me shouldn't be happening. He doesn't know the whole story, does he? Comments or questions on those two verses?
Let's see, let's compare.
Right.
We always say we're quick to say this is what I would do in this situation, which that's what you just read. It was like this is how it's going to turn out, and now that it's turned out, that he's like, wait a minute here, this is not what I expected.
Exactly. Anyone else? Oh, well, I should have turned the page because I've got a whole other section on these two verses. It was on the second page. How about that? Well, no, that's why I'm missing a whole page. Well, this could get interesting. Let's see if I'm just out of order. There we go. Whew, I was just out of order. That was going to be really confusing because the notes I had in the second page didn't even line up with the first two verses. That wasn't going to make a whole lot of sense. Next, I put verses 3 through 5 together. And I just wanted to mention that in the King James Version, there's a different term here. So he says, in the ESV, he says, "Behold, I am of small account." Okay, and in the ESV, he says, "Behold, I am vile." You need to understand that if you're reading the King James and you come to that word vile, vile at this time did not mean what we think of vile meaning today. Okay? Vile at that time meant that I am of little account, that I'm unimportant, that I'm not perfect. Okay? We think of vile today as something really bad, right? Terrible, vile sinners, right? Job's not, he's not saying that he's a terrible, vile person. He's saying, if you're reading the King James, that he's simply an imperfect or of lesser account than God here. Yes?
It's significant there,
Yes.
which makes it easier to understand, I think.
Yes. It does help, we always need to keep in mind when you're using, the older the translation that you're using, the further we are away from understanding what that term meant at the time, right? So I'm sure if we were translating it today and writing it, and somebody reads it 100 years from now, we might be tempted to use terms that they're going to shake their head and, what did that mean, right? We're in that same situation when we read things from the King James Version. That word maybe had a very different meaning at that time. So it is helpful to read multiple translations and maybe get a better understanding of the meaning. So finally here we have Job is going to respond. Job's been asking for this for chapters and chapters. And here comes his big opportunity. That's why I just read you what he said in 23. What was he going to say? I'm going to make my arguments. God's not going to put me down. He's going to have to listen to what I have to say. That was his attitude back in chapter 23, right? A little different here. I feel we can take two things away from this huge change in tone that we see in the part of Job that we read here. In the previous chapters, he was lashing out in despair and emotional pain. The interactions that he had with his so-called friends was not helping the situation at all. It was just making him more frustrated, more despondent. They were no help at all, were they? At times, though his words were not false, considering what he knew, they also at times did not show proper respect for God and his authority. We have to keep in mind, some things we know Job said are in error, but to the best of his knowledge, some of those things weren't in error from his perspective, from his understanding. It's because of his incomplete understanding. So the first thing I think we can take away is the non-complimentary observation. Faced with the presence of God, Job is humbled. Now that's not truly uncomplimentary. But my comment here was, I'm going to guess that every one of us probably knows someone who's a big talker. Well, I'm going to take care of this person, or I'm going to tell the boss this, I'll straighten him out, or her out, or whoever it may be. And then you go sit in a meeting with that boss and that topic comes up, and what does that person say? Nothing. Yeah. Crickets. They're a big talker when they're not faced with the situation. They get really humble when they have to actually come forth and talk about it, right? Now, I'm not saying that's all that's at work here with Job. It's not simply that he is facing God and he is humbled in his presence, but God has just spent the last 2 chapters educating Job. There's a difference, Job. You, me, here's what you know and understand. You can't even imagine what I know and understand. I think that's sunk in for Job. We have a couple of things at work here. So his understanding that there's that big difference, and also that sense that God's presence has returned to him. And that's been the thing he's most been sorely missing. The second observation was that following God's teaching in the previous chapters, he's calmed himself. Job has calmed himself. And he's been reminded of and accepted that position, that difference between the creator and the created. Most importantly, once again, he feels God's presence. And like I said, I think out of all the things that Job has endured here, that's been the thing that's been heaviest on his heart, is that sense that God was not with him. We have the word behold here in chapter 4, suggesting that to Job, the things he has learned in the last 2 chapters are a revelation, things he didn't understand before. God has opened his eyes to that difference. He says he's of small account. Again, that's relative to the creator. The created thing is a small thing. Now these notes make more sense. It says, I lay my hand on my mouth. He's going to prevent his emotions from allowing him to say something that will shame him before the Creator. He hasn't done the greatest job of that in some of the previous chapters. He's wised up. I'm just going to put my hand over my mouth, so anything I might be tempted to say just isn't going to come out. Now, in reality, when it comes to us dealing with God, does that mean God still doesn't know what we're thinking, even if it doesn't come out of our mouth? Of course not. Job's doing his best, though, here to be more respectful and to not do things that are he's going to be embarrassed for later. If you were to flash back to chapter 29, verses 2 through 9. I just want you to see where this isn't the first time we've heard him say something like this. All All right, so beginning in verse 2, this is Job lamenting the difference between his current situation and the way it used to be. He says, "Oh, that I were as in the months of old and as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone upon my head and by his light I walked through darkness. As I was in my prime, when the friendship of God was upon my tent, when the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were all around me, when the steps were washed with butter and the rocks poured out from me streams of oil, when I went out to the gate of the city, when I prepared my seat in the square, the young men saw me and withdrew, and the aged rose and stood. The princes refrained from talking and laid their hands on their mouths." Isn't this a big turnaround? Job was talking here about how the others had such great respect for him that they put their hands over their mouths so they didn't say something silly in his presence, being concerned that they would be made to look foolish if they said the things that they might just blurt out. Shoes on the other foot now. Job's the one realizing, I'm in the presence of something so great, I probably just really shouldn't talk. There's nothing I can say that's going to help my case at this point. Over the course of his exchanges with his friends, he now realizes that he had said things during those exchanges that he should not have, and he gives up all claim to seeking a day in court with God that he might argue with him and have any thought that he would win that argument. David Guzik had a comment on these verses where he stated, all of the arguing of Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and Elihu could not bring Job to this place that he's at now. Only the revelation of God could so humble Job and set him in his right place before the Lord. Job made his strong and sometimes outrageous statements when he felt to the core of his soul that the Lord had forsaken him. Now, with a sense of the presence of the Lord restored, Job could better see his proper place before God. I'll tell you, like I've mentioned before when I do class, David Guzik is one of the commentators I like to read. But I'm always going to tell you to take what he says with a grain of salt because he has some very different views on things. But there are times when I really find his insights into some of these things very helpful. Verses 6 and 7, the Lord God addresses Job again. So Job has said basically, God, I've spoken out of turn in the past. I'm not going to say anything. There's nothing I can add to this conversation. So God is going to continue this conversation himself. Job's response has demonstrated that he indeed learned at least something from what God had taught him in the previous chapters. God's going to continue the lesson. The previous challenges that he brought before him focused on Job's knowledge or wisdom, comparing it to God's. Obviously, it could not compare. The next series of lessons will focus on power. We talk about God's omniscience. So we talk about omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence, right? So the first set of challenges were dealt with his omniscience. God knows everything. He possesses all wisdom, and nothing is hidden from him. Unlike man, can't make any of those claims. We talk about God's omnipresence. He is everywhere at once. Man certainly cannot accomplish that. And we talk about his omnipotence. God is all-powerful. Whatever can be accomplished by power, God can accomplish. That certainly can't be said of men, but that's the lesson that God is going to teach Job next. The difference between the power of God and the power that man possesses. Does anybody want to ask any questions or make any comments before we move on? Michael.
Just this section, the first 5 verses, is kind of thinking about it. You mentioned this idea that Job seems calm and being in the presence of God or having that understanding. I mean, if we think of times when we've been Because I know who's in charge, that there is someone in charge.
Yes.
And I want you to believe that.
And Morton, to your point, what a benefit for us that we can read that standard, right? Job didn't have what we have, so he's groping in the dark a bit. He understands that there is a God. Obviously, through the discussions we've read, between he and his friends, mankind understood there was a God, understood there was right and wrong. But did they have anything to just open up and read and have revealed to them the way we do today? Yes?
The thought that I had when you said that was, we know Job was a wealthy individual. His three friends must have been probably similar because they were able to leave their places of abode and come right in when the problems occurred. So, and playing off what Michael just said, kind of made me think more of it was we see it today that people that have money or wealth think that their opinions are more valuable. I'm wondering if the three friends and the Job fell in this category was apparently I'm so smart because I've gained all this wealth, so I'm so smart, my opinion counts for what we see it like. Of course, what Michael does for a living, he probably can expand on that a lot more because we see money influence a lot of things to sway that this is the way you should feel, and you should feel the same way as I feel because I've got a lot of money to show you.
People in our world confuse worldly success with wisdom. So yes, some of the most financially successful people are morally bankrupt, are they not? Many of them achieve that through taking advantage of others. Not all. Some are simply successful because they come up with brilliant ideas, right? But many of those who are financially, really well off have gotten there by taking advantage of others. Thank you. All right, we'll move on to verses 8 and 9. So God here asked Job, would you suggest that I, God, am wrong in order to make yourself seem right? It's kind of, at times, what Job has implied. He has suggested that he's being unfairly singled out for punishment when he's been such a righteous man. The idea there is claiming that I, Job, am right, and God, you've made a mistake. So God pretty much just wastes no time, calls him right out on it. Job, are you really suggesting that I am wrong in order to make yourself right? We can appreciate that sense of logic, I guess, from Job as fellow fallible human beings, right? We never want to admit we're the ones in the wrong. Somebody has mistreated us somehow. That's how we got where we are. It's not what we deserve. But in this case, Job was incorrect, and we know that. And then he goes on to ask, do you possess a power like God's? That's the idea of, do you have an arm like God? Do you possess the strength and the power that God possesses? Can you do the things I can do? Can you thunder your voice? God can certainly do that. But this is just the beginning of the issues or the demonstrations, the individual situations where God's going to bring about that's going to show that differential in power. That takes us into verses 10 through 14. So God's going to ask Job a series of questions about, all right, here are things I can do. Can you do them? Can you adorn yourself with majesty and dignity? So he says, can you perform the works that I, God, have performed and claim the majesty that goes along with them? We don't just give God the majesty because he says to. We do it because we have seen evidence of his power. The things that he tells us he can do, he has demonstrated that he's done, right? Throughout the recorded things recorded for us in the Bible. He asks him, Job, can you bring low and humble those who are proud, meaning those who are self-important, who are cruel to others, who gain by abusing others? Can you stop that personally? Can you, all by yourself, not you and a whole community of men, but you, Job, can you go stop all those injustices? Can you stop every one of those men who mistreat other people? Obviously, Job can't do that. Now, we know today, even in a country like ours, if you added up every person who is in law enforcement of one kind or another, be it local, county, state, federal, there's probably over 1 million law enforcement people, right? And we still can't stop every person who abuses and mistreats others. So certainly Job was never going to accomplish that on his own. And yet God could. If he so chose, he could strike down every one of those people who abuse others. And our temptation may be to say, well, why doesn't he do that? Why would you think he wouldn't do that? Exactly. I'm pretty glad he doesn't. Because there's probably been times in my own life when I've made that mistake and I've, be it intentionally or unintentionally, taken advantage of someone else, right? So I'm really thankful that God doesn't just say, oh, you did it, you're taken care of, you're gone. He gives me another chance. He gives me the opportunity to see my error, to do my best to make up for it, to change my behavior going forward. I'm really thankful that he doesn't just strike down everyone who makes every mistake, right? Or we would all be in a lot of trouble. He asks him, can you bring the wicked to justice? Job, can you take the very breath of life from the wicked and send them to Sheol? So that's that idea of, can you take care of all these? And we know that God could if that was what he chose to do. But then he makes an interesting statement. If you look at verse 14, he says, Job, if you could do these things, if you can honestly tell me that you can do these things I just asked about, then I'll agree that you're capable of saving yourself. You would have no need of me if you could do these things. That's a pretty interesting statement to me, just because I think this is just the tiniest portion of God's power, right? This is minor compared to, he hasn't even talked about creation. But if you could even just do these little things, I'd say you could save yourself and you wouldn't even need me. Reality is you can't do these things. That is why you need me. Job recognizes this, realizes that God is his only hope of salvation. Yeah. Hey, we're actually going to get through this chapter. Because surprisingly for, 10 verses, I have fewer notes than I had for 3 verses, the previous 3 verses. So we read about the description of the behemoth. Okay, God is going to describe here, and then the beginning of the next chapter, 2 creatures that are part of his creation that are just incredible, right? And the first one he describes as behemoth. We might be tempted to think that God's going back to this idea of the things he created like he had in the previous chapters, right? And then he's abandoning this idea of power. No, these 2 animals that he's bringing up aren't about his ability to create or his design. They're about power, okay? These 2 animals are a continuation. Let's see. First, he describes the behemoth. He describes it as a land animal. Seems safe to say that this was probably the largest and most powerful of all the land animals that God had created. I think it's also fair to say that this thing probably lives in the wild and man didn't encounter it very often, because God gives a great description of it And if man saw that on a regular basis, he probably wouldn't have needed to describe it so thoroughly, right? So it's probably one of those things that God is aware of. Again, his knowledge, his wisdom, right? He knows the things that are out there, but that man does not encounter. We continue to use the word that's described here today. It's used as a noun. I looked it up in an actual dictionary. A huge or monstrous creature. That pretty well fits the description that we have right here of this animal, is it not? The main point that we're going to get of both the behemoth and the Leviathan that we're going to read about in the next chapter is this. Job cannot contend or compete with this creature. He cannot domesticate it. He cannot control it. He cannot capture and hold it. And yet, it is a creation of God and completely subject to God. It wouldn't even begin to, challenge God. Job, like the behemoth, has to come to grips with the fact that there is a difference between the creator and the created. The created is subservient to the creator. Even this behemoth, which is so much more powerful than man physically, recognizes that it is subservient to God. And therefore Job needs to recognize he is subservient to God as well. I believe that takes us to the end of chapter 40. We probably have like 1 minute before John's going to press the bell. Does anybody have a question or comment they'd like to add before we close? Okay, then you get an extra minute to talk. Thank you, everybody, for your participation.